The gunshot echoed across the vast Texas plains, but Zara Blackburn barely flinched as she crept through the shadows behind McAllister's general store in San Elizario. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not from the distant sound of trouble, but from the fear of getting caught. Her baby's cries had finally ceased back at their makeshift camp, exhausted from hunger rather than satisfied by food. This thought steeled her nerves as she reached for the crate of supplies left negligently by the back door. Texas, in 1876, was unforgiving to a woman alone, especially one with a 3-month-old infant and not a penny to her name. The moonlight cast long shadows across the dusty ground as Zara's trembling fingers closed around a small sack of cornmeal. She moved to grab a tin of beans when a throat cleared behind her. "Madam, I believe those goods ain't been paid for." The deep voice froze her in place. Slowly, Zara turned, clutching the cornmeal to her chest like a shield. Standing before her was a tall man, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his Stetson, but she could make out the glint of his eyes in the moonlight. A star-shaped badge reflected on his leather vest. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from days of thirst. "My baby hasn't eaten in 2 days." The man stepped closer, and Zara could now see his face clearly weathered by sun and wind, but younger than she expected, perhaps 30. His expression was stern but not cruel. "I'm not the law, madam," he said, tapping the badge. "Just the ranch foreman from the crosswind. Name's Hayes Xavier." He glanced at the meager goods in her hands and then back at her face, noting the hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes. "Where's your husband?" "Dead," Zara replied, her chin lifting slightly despite her circumstances. "Fever took him 3 months ago, just after our son was born. We were heading to California." She didn't mention how Thomas had gambled away their savings before succumbing to illness, leaving her with nothing but a hungry baby and desperate choices. Hayes studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant piano music from the saloon down the street. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. "Put that back," he said, nodding to the cornmeal. "I'll buy you proper supplies." Zara hesitated, suspicion clouding her features. Men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. That was a lesson she'd learned well. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've been hungry too," Hayes replied simply. He gestured toward the store's front entrance. "Come on." McAllister's still open for another hour. Reluctantly, Zara replaced the cornmeal and followed him around to the front of the store. The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose at the sight of her dirt-streaked face, tattered dress, but Hayes's presence seemed to quell any comments. "Evening, Jacob," Hayes greeted the shopkeeper. "The lady needs supplies: milk, bread, dried meat, beans, coffee, and—" He glanced at Zara. "Diapers," she murmured, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, "and perhaps some oats." Hayes nodded. "And all that too." As Jacob gathered the items, Zara stood awkwardly near the door, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. When Hayes paid for everything without hesitation, she felt a strange mixture of relief and deeper suspicion. Outside, Hayes handed her the supplies, which she accepted with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said stiffly. "I'll repay you somehow." Hayes adjusted his hat, looking past her into the darkness. "Where are you staying?" Zara shifted uncomfortably. "I have a small camp by the creek." "With a baby," Hayes frowned. "There were coyotes spotted near there yesterday." Fear flashed across Zara's face before she could hide it. Her son was alone, wrapped in the only blanket she owned, tucked beneath a scrubby mesquite tree. "Look," Hayes said after a moment of consideration, "the Crosswind Ranch needs help. Cook left last month and the boys are about ready to revolt over my attempts at biscuits." A small smile cracked his serious demeanor. "It's honest work with room and board for you and your child." Zara stared at him, searching for deceit in his eyes. I can't." "You can cook?" Hayes asked. "Yes, but then you can do the job." He gestured to the parcels in her arms. "Take these to your boy, feed him, think about it overnight. If you're interested, I'll be back in town tomorrow at noon. Meet me here." Before Zara could respond, Hayes tipped his hat and strode away, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden boardwalk. Dawn broke over San Elizario, painting the adobe buildings in golden light. Zara sat beside the creek, watching her son, Henry, sleep peacefully for the first time in days. His small belly was full, his face relaxed in slumber. She'd stayed awake all night, partly to guard against the coyotes Hayes had mentioned, and partly to consider his offer. Working at a ranch would mean shelter and regular meals for Henry. It would mean safety. But it could also mean danger of a different kind. She'd heard stories of women in her position being taken advantage of. Yet something in Hayes Xavier's eyes had seemed trustworthy, and the desperation of her situation left few alternatives. By mid-morning, Zara had packed her meager belongings and begun the walk back to town, Henry secured against her chest with a length of fabric. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, and by the time Sena Lazario's buildings came into view, she was drenched in sweat. Hayes was already waiting outside McAllister's, sitting on a bench with one ankle crossed over his knee. He stood when he spotted her approaching. "You came," he observed, his expression neutral. "I did," Zara replied. "I accept your offer, for now." Hayes nodded, then his gaze fell to the bundle against her chest. "That's the little one." Zara shifted the fabric, revealing Henry's sleeping face. "This is Henry." Something softened in Hayes's expression. "He looks healthy." "Thanks to your food," Zara said quietly. Hayes cleared his throat. "My wagon's this way. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch." The wagon was simple but sturdy, with a canvas covering to shield them from the sun. Hayes helped Zara up, careful not to disturb the baby, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they left Sena Lazario behind, Zara watched the town recede, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But Henry stirred against her, making small, contented sounds, and she knew she'd had no real choice. "The ranch belongs to the Thornton family," Hayes explained as they traveled. "Old man Thornton passed last winter. His daughter Elizabeth runs it now with her husband. Good people. Fair." "How many men work there?" Zara asked cautiously. 8 hands, including me," Hayes replied. "All decent enough fellows. They'll respect you as the cook, Mrs." He glanced at her questioningly. "Blackburn," she supplied. "Zara Blackburn, but I'm a widow now, so I suppose it's just Miss Blackburn." "Miss Blackburn," Hayes repeated. "Well, you'll have your own quarters off the kitchen, private. The men sleep in the bunkhouse." Zara nodded, somewhat relieved. "And my wages, room and board plus $15 a month," Hayes said. "More than fair for these parts." It was more than fair, it was generous, suspicious even. But Zara was in no position to negotiate, and the amount would allow her to save for a future for Henry. The landscape shifted as they traveled, from flat plains to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and oak. Eventually they crested a rise, and the Crosswind Ranch spread before them, a sprawling main house with a wide porch, a large barn, corral, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and a windmill turned lazily above a water tank. "It's larger than I expected," Zara admitted. "One of the biggest spreads in the county," Hayes said with a hint of pride. "The Thorntons worked hard for it." As they approached, a woman emerged from the main house, shading her eyes against the sun. She was tall and straight-backed, with dark hair pulled into a sensible bun. Hayes raised a hand in greeting as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Mrs. Thornton," he called, "found us a cook." Elizabeth Thornton approached, her shrewd eyes taking in Zara and the baby with one sweeping glance. "About time. The men were about to stage a revolt over your flapjacks, Hayes." Hayes's lips twitched. "They weren't that bad." "They were fit for risoling boots, not eating," Mrs. Thornton retorted, then turned to Zara. "Welcome to Crosswind, Miss." "Blackburn," Zara supplied. "Zara Blackburn." "And this is my son, Henry." Mrs. Thornton's expression softened slightly at the sight of the baby. "How old?" 3 months, madam." "Well, Miss Blackburn, if you can cook half as well as Hayes claims, you'll be a welcome addition." She gestured toward the house. "Let's get you settled." "Hayes, have Miguel bring her things to the cook's quarters." Hayes nodded and jumped down from the wagon, extending a hand to help Zara. As her feet touched the ground, Henry began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching in discomfort. "He's probably hungry," Zara explained, embarrassed by the disruption. "Then feed him," Mrs. Thornton said matter-of-factly. "Come inside, we'll talk while you tend to your boy." The main house was cool and spacious, with polished wooden floors and simple, sturdy furniture. Mrs. Thornton led Zara to a small sitting room and motioned for her to sit. "I'll have tea brought." she said, then paused. Hayes says you were in a difficult situation. Zara stiffened. My husband died. I was doing what I had to do. Mrs. Thornton regarded her steadily. I wasn't judging you, Miss Blackburn. This country is hard on women alone. I know that better than most. She glanced briefly at a portrait on the wall, a stern-faced man Zara assumed was the late Mr. Thornton. I'll leave you to feed your child. When you're ready, Hayes will show you to your quarters. Left alone, Zara adjusted her clothing to nurse Henry, who latched on hungrily despite having eaten well the night before. As she sat in the quiet room, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had a roof, safety, and a job. It was more than she'd had yesterday, and for now it would have to be enough. Later, Hayes showed her to the cook's quarters, a small but clean room attached to the kitchen house, with a narrow bed, a crib that looked newly constructed, and a washstand. The men eat at 5 in the morning and 6 in the evening, Hayes explained. Mrs. Thornton and Mr. Thornton take their meals in the main house, but they expect the same quality. Zara nodded, taking in her new domain a large kitchen with a cast-iron stove, ample workspace, and a well-stocked pantry. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Hayes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Just do your job well, Miss Blackburn, that's all the thanks I need. He tipped his hat and left her to settle in. That night, as Zara laid Henry in the crib and crawled into her own bed, the first real bed she'd slept in for months, she whispered a prayer of gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were safe. The rooster's crow woke Zara well before dawn. Disoriented, she sat up quickly, then remembered where she was. Henry was still sleeping, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. She allowed herself a moment to watch him before rising to begin her first day of work. The kitchen was well equipped but would take some getting used to. Zara stoked the stove fire and began preparing breakfast for 8 hungry ranch hands biscuits, gravy, eggs from the henhouse, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, as her father used to say. By the time the men filed in at 5 o'clock, Henry had woken, been fed, and was tucked securely in his crib. Zara smoothed her hair nervously as the kitchen door swung open and the cowboys entered, their spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Hayes led the group, nodding politely to Zara. Morning, Miss Blackburn. Smells good in here. The others murmured similar greetings, eyeing her curiously but respectfully. They were a diverse group, a couple of young men barely out of boyhood, several weathered veterans of the range, and a Mexican vaquero who introduced himself as Miguel with a courtly bow that made Zara blush. Best get used to feeding an army, Hayes said as the men loaded their plates. These boys eat like they're never seeing food again. The meal passed with minimal conversation, the men too focused on eating to talk much. When they finished, each man brought his plate to a washbasin near the door, thanked Zara with varying degrees of awkwardness, and filed out to begin their day's work. Hayes was the last to leave. That was the best meal we've had in months, he said quietly. The men appreciate it. Zara nodded, oddly pleased by the simple compliment. I'll have supper ready at 6. For the next few days, Zara fell into a rhythm, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, tending to Henry between meals, baking bread and preparing supper in the afternoons. The work was hard but straightforward, and the men were respectful if distant. Hayes, however, began to stop by more frequently. At first, his visits seemed professional, checking that she had everything she needed, informing her of how many men would be present for meals. But gradually, he lingered longer, sometimes offering to hold Henry while Zara kneaded dough or stirred stew. On her 4th evening at Crosswind, as Zara was clearing away the supper dishes, Henry began to cry insistently from his crib. Her hands were deep in dishwater and she sighed, knowing she'd have to dry off completely before tending to him. I can get him, Hayes offered unexpectedly from the doorway. He'd returned after the other men had left for the bunkhouse. Zara hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. Hayes crossed to the crib and gently lifted Henry, who continued to fuss. Hey there, little man, he murmured, settling the baby against his shoulder with surprising ease. Your mama's busy, let's give her a minute. To Zara's astonishment, Henry quieted almost immediately, His sobs reduced to hiccuping sniffles as Hayes paced slowly around the kitchen, patting the baby's back with a large, calloused hand. "You've done this before," Zara observed, quickly finishing the dishes. Hayes's expression turned wistful. "My sister had 4 little ones. I helped when I could." "Where is she now?" Zara asked, drying her hands on her apron. "Gone," Hayes replied simply. "Cholera 3 years ago, her husband too. The children live with my aunt in Austin." "I'm sorry," Zara said softly, crossing to take Henry from him. Their hands brushed during the transfer, and Zara felt an unexpected warmth at the contact. "Life out here is fragile," Hayes said, his voice low. "Makes you appreciate what you've got while you have it." His eyes met hers for a brief, intense moment before he cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should let you get some rest. Early start tomorrow." After he left, Zara stood holding Henry, thinking about Hayes Xavier and wondering about the life he'd led before Crosswind. There was a gentleness to him that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, and despite her determination to remain detached and professional, she found herself curious. The weeks passed, and summer settled fully over Texas, bringing scorching heat that made the kitchen nearly unbearable by midday. Zara adapted, rising even earlier to do most of the cooking before the worst heat set in, and preparing cold suppers when possible. Henry thrived in their new environment, growing plumper and more alert every day. The ranch hands had taken to greeting him whenever they entered the kitchen, and even Mrs. Thornton occasionally stopped by to check on the little cowboy, as she'd taken to calling him. One sweltering afternoon in late July, as Zara sat on the small stoop outside her quarters, trying to catch a breeze while Henry napped inside, Hayes approached leading his horse. "Miss Blackburn," he greeted, removing his hat. Sweat glistened on his brow and his shirt clung to his broad shoulders. "How are you managing in this heat?" "As well as can be expected," Zara replied, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. "The men seem to appreciate the cold ham and beans tonight." Hayes smiled slightly. "We appreciate anything you cook, Miss Blackburn." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the windmill. "I'm riding into town for supplies," Hayes finally said. "Thought you might have a list of things you need for the kitchen." Zara hesitated. "Actually, I was hoping to go into town myself soon. Henry needs new clothes, he's growing so fast, and I—" She trailed off, embarrassed to admit her own needs. Hayes studied her for a moment. "I can take you tomorrow. It's Saturday, most of the men will be here, so you won't be missed for breakfast. We can be back in time for you to prepare supper." Zara's face lit up. "Really, that would be wonderful. Be ready at 7, Hayes said, settling his hat back on his head. "And bring the boy. A day out will do you both good." The next morning dawned marginally cooler, with a breeze that promised some relief from the relentless heat. Zara dressed carefully in her best and only dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been quite pretty. She bathed and dressed Henry in the cleanest of his few garments, packing an extra diaper and a bottle of milk for the journey. Hayes was waiting with the wagon at precisely 7, looking freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. He helped Zara and Henry up onto the seat with careful hands. "You look nice," he said simply, then immediately turned his attention to the horses, as if embarrassed by the compliment. The journey to San Elizario was pleasant, with Hayes pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. Henry sat contentedly on Zara's lap, fascinated by the passing scenery and the gentle rocking of the wagon. In town, Hayes escorted them first to the general store, where Zara purchased kitchen supplies and a few simple garments for Henry. When she hesitantly examined a bolt of fabric for herself, Hayes insisted on adding it to their purchases. "The ranch can afford it," he said firmly when she protested. "Consider it part of your wages." Afterward, they stopped at a small cafe for lunch, a luxury Zara hadn't experienced in over a year. As they ate, several townspeople greeted Hayes respectfully, their curious gazes lingering on Zara and Henry. "They're wondering who you are," Hayes remarked, noticing her discomfort. "What have you told them?" Zara asked. "That you're the new cook at Crosswind," Hayes replied. "Nothing more, your business is your own." Zara nodded gratefully. "Thank you for that, and for today, it's been nice to feel normal again." Hayes's expression softened. You deserve normal, Miss Blackburn, and more. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness or understanding. The moment was broken when Henry dropped his wooden toy, causing both adults to reach for it simultaneously. Their hands touched, lingered, then separated as Hayes retrieved the toy and returned it to the baby with a gentle smile. On the return journey, Henry fell asleep in Zara's arms, his small face peaceful in slumber. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape as Hayes guided the horses at a leisurely pace. "May I ask you something personal?" Zara ventured after a long silence. Hayes glanced at her, then back at the road. "You may ask, I might not answer. Why aren't you married?" The question left her lips before she could reconsider its propriety. Hayes raised an eyebrow but didn't seem offended. "Never found the right woman, I suppose, or when I did, the timing wasn't right." He paused. "This life isn't easy on families. I've seen too many women worn down by it, too many children raised without fathers because the work takes men away for weeks at a time." "But you're good with children," Zara observed, looking down at Henry. "You would make a fine father." A small smile touched Hayes's lips. "Maybe someday. If the right woman comes along who doesn't mind the hardships." The implication hung in the air between them, unacknowledged but present nonetheless. Zara felt her cheeks warm and changed the subject to safer topics for the remainder of the journey. That evening, after preparing a simple supper for the men, Zara sat in her room sewing new garments for Henry from the fabric Hayes had purchased. Her mind kept returning to their day together, to the easy conversation and the moment of connection in the cafe. It had been a long time since she'd felt so comfortable with anyone, especially a man. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Hayes standing there, holding a small wooden object. "Sorry to disturb you," he said. "I made this today and thought Henry might like it." He handed her a beautifully carved wooden rattle, smooth and polished to a soft gleam. Zara took it, turning it over in her hands admiringly. "Hayes, this is lovely," she said. "You made this today. When did you have time?" He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Had some scrap wood." "It didn't take long." Zara glanced at Henry, already asleep in his crib. "I'll give it to him in the morning. He'll love it." She looked back at Hayes, standing awkwardly in her doorway. "Would you like to come in? I have coffee." Hayes hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a minute." He sat at the small table while Zara poured coffee into two mismatched cups. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly how natural it felt to have him in her space, sharing a quiet evening. "I want to thank you again," she said, sitting across from him. "Not just for today, but for everything. You saved us, Hayes. I don't know where we would be if you hadn't caught me that night." Hayes stared into his coffee. "You'd have found a way. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Perhaps," Zara conceded, "but I'm grateful nonetheless." They talked quietly for an hour, sharing pieces of their pasts. Hayes spoke of growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing his parents young, and making his way west with his sister's family. Zara told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her hasty marriage to Thomas when she was just 18, and their ill-fated journey west. "He wasn't a bad man," she said of her late husband. "Just reckless, impulsive. He believed fortune was always waiting just around the next corner." "And you?" Hayes asked. "What did you believe?" Zara considered the question. "I believed in him until I couldn't anymore." She smiled sadly. "But he gave me Henry, so I can't regret it entirely." When Hayes finally rose to leave, there was a reluctance in his movements that matched the feeling in Zara's chest. At the door, he turned to her, his expression serious. "Zara," he said, using her given name for the first time. "I want you to know that you and Henry have a place here for as long as you want it, no matter what." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. "Thank you, Hayes." After he left, Zara sat for a long time, watching Henry sleep and contemplating the unexpected turn her life had taken. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to think beyond mere survival, to imagine a future that might include more than just getting through each day. It was a dangerous luxury, but tonight, she indulged in it. August brought no relief from the heat, but did bring a new development to Crosswind Ranch. Word of rustlers operating in the area. Several neighboring ranches had lost cattle, and tension hung in the air during mealtimes as the men discussed strategies for protecting the Thornton herd. "We'll need to increase the night patrols," Hayes announced one evening as the men finished supper. "Miguel, you and Parker take the North Range tonight. Johnson and I will ride the south border." The men nodded grimly, and Zara, clearing dishes nearby, felt a flutter of concern. Hayes caught her expression and lingered after the others had filed out. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "It's just a precaution." "These rustlers," Zara asked, "are they dangerous?" Hayes's hesitation told her more than his words. "They've avoided confrontation so far, probably just opportunists looking for easy profit." "Be careful," Zara said, surprising herself with the intensity of her concern. Hayes's expression softened. "Always am." He reached out briefly, his fingers brushing her hand where it rested on the table, then withdrew and left to prepare for his patrol. That night, Zara slept fitfully, waking at every sound. Henry sensed her unease and was fussier than usual, requiring multiple feedings and comforting. By dawn, she was exhausted but relieved to hear the men returning from their night watches, their voices low but relaxed, suggesting an uneventful patrol. The pattern continued for nearly 2 weeks: increased vigilance, night patrols, and no sign of the rustlers. The atmosphere at Crosswind gradually eased, and life returned to its normal rhythm. Hayes, however, remained cautious, continuing the night watches despite the men's grumbling about lost sleep. "Better tired than robbed blind," he told them firmly. September arrived with the first hint of autumn in the morning air. Henry was now nearly 6 months old and growing more active every day, attempting to crawl and babbling constantly. The wooden rattle Hayes had made was his favorite toy, and he squealed with delight whenever Hayes entered the kitchen, recognizing the man who often played with him while Zara worked. The relationship between Zara and Hayes had evolved gradually over the weeks. Their conversations had grown deeper, their comfort with each other more evident. Sometimes their hands would touch when passing dishes or when both reached for Henry, and increasingly those touches lingered. Neither had spoken openly of their feelings, but Zara found herself watching for Hayes at mealtimes, disappointed when ranch business kept him away. And Hayes, for his part, found more and more reasons to visit the kitchen between meals, often bringing small gifts, wildflowers he'd picked on the range, a particularly ripe apple from the small orchard, once even a ribbon for her hair purchased in town. Mrs. Thornton observed these developments with knowing eyes but made no comment beyond a cryptic remark to Zara one afternoon. "Hayes is a good man, steady, the kind who stays." The implication was clear, and Zara had blushed deeply but didn't disagree. On a particularly fine September evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Hayes appeared at Zara's door after supper. "The men are playing cards in the bunkhouse," he said. "I thought you and Henry might enjoy a walk. The night's going to be cool." Zara agreed eagerly, wrapping Henry in a light blanket and stepping out into the twilight. They walked slowly toward a small rise near the main house, where a lone oak tree provided a natural resting spot. "Henry's getting so big," Hayes remarked as they settled beneath the tree, the baby sitting contentedly on Zara's lap. "He is," Zara agreed. "He'll be crawling properly any day now, and then I'll never keep up with him." Hayes chuckled, then reached out to brush a strand of hair from Zara's face, his touch gentle. "You're a good mother, Zara. He's lucky to have you." The tenderness in his voice made her heart flutter. "And I'm lucky to have found Crosswind, to have found." She hesitated, then gathered her courage. "To have found you." Hayes's eyes darkened with emotion. He leaned closer, his intent clear, and Zara felt herself drawn toward him. Anticipation building. A gunshot shattered the moment, followed by shouts from the direction of the corral. Hayes was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Get to the house," he ordered, all tenderness replaced by urgent command. Now, Zara clutched Henry to her chest and ran toward the main house as Hayes sprinted toward the commotion. From the safety of the porch, she watched as men emerged from the bunkhouse, guns drawn. More shots rang out and the night erupted into chaos. Mrs. Thornton appeared beside her, a shotgun in her hands. "Inside," she said grimly. "Lock the doors." For nearly an hour, Zara paced the main house sitting room, Henry wailing in her arms, terrified by the noise and tension. Mrs. Thornton stood guard at the window, her face set in determined lines. Occasionally, they heard shouts or gunfire, but the chaos seemed to be moving away from the house toward the western pasture. Finally, hoofbeats approached, and Mrs. Thornton raised her shotgun until a familiar voice called out, "Elizabeth, it's clear." Mr. Thornton entered, his face grim. "Rustlers, 4 of them tried to drive off a section of the herd. We stopped them." "Casualties?" Mrs. Thornton asked sharply. "Miguel took a bullet in the arm, nothing serious. One of the rustlers is dead, the others escaped." Zara's heart pounded painfully. "Hayes." Mr. Thornton's expression softened slightly. "He's fine. Organizing the men to secure the perimeter." Relief washed over Zara so intensely that her knees weakened, and she sank into the nearest chair, still clutching Henry. It was nearly midnight before Hayes appeared at the main house, his face dusty and drawn with fatigue but otherwise unharmed. His eyes sought Zara immediately, and the tension in his shoulders eased visibly when he saw her and Henry safe. "It's over," he told the Thorntons. "The sheriff's been notified. He'll be out in the morning to collect the body and take statements." Mrs. Thornton nodded. "Good work, Hayes. Get some rest." As Hayes turned to leave, Zara rose and followed him to the porch, Henry now sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the earlier disturbance. "You're really all right?" she asked softly, studying his face in the lantern light. "I'm fine," he assured her. "Just tired." He reached out to touch Henry's cheek gently. "You both should get some sleep too." "Hayes," Zara began, suddenly needing to speak the words that had been building in her heart. Before the shots, Hayes placed a finger lightly on her lips, silencing her. "Not tonight," he said gently. "Not like this, with gunpowder still in the air and nerves raw. Tomorrow, when things are calm, we'll talk then." Reluctantly, Zara nodded. Hayes leaned forward and pressed a brief, tender kiss to her forehead, then descended the porch steps and disappeared into the darkness. True to his word, the sheriff arrived the next morning, a gruff man named Hollister who viewed the dead rustler without surprise. "Jenkins," he identified the body. "Been causing trouble all over the county. The others are probably Waller and the Dobson brothers. I'll find them." The day passed in a flurry of activity statements given, the body removed, the injured Miguel tended to, and the regular ranch work continuing despite the disruption. Zara barely saw Hayes, who was occupied with the sheriff and then with calming the still nervous cattle. It wasn't until after supper, when the men had retired early, exhausted from the previous night's events, that Hayes finally appeared at Zara's door. "Can we talk?" he asked simply. Zara nodded, gesturing him inside. Henry was already asleep, worn out from a day of increased attention from everyone on the ranch, who seemed to need the reassurance of the baby's innocent presence after the violence. They sat at the small table, the lantern casting a warm glow over Hayes's features. He looked tired but resolved, his eyes steady on hers. "Last night," he began, "before the rustlers, I was about to do something I've wanted to do for weeks now." Zara's heart quickened. "And what was that?" Instead of answering with words, Hayes leaned across the table and kissed her a gentle, questioning kiss that became firmer when Zara responded, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they finally parted, Hayes took her hands in his. "I never expected this," he said softly. "When I found you behind that store, I was just trying to help someone in need. I didn't know you'd become so important to me. And I didn't expect to find safety or happiness or—" Zara's voice faltered. "Or love, not after everything." Hayes's grip on her hands tightened. "Is that what this is? Love?" Zara met his gaze steadily. "I think it might be, for me at least." "For me too," Hayes admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Zara Blackburn, you and that boy of yours." Joy bloomed in Zara's chest, bright and unexpected. "I love you too, Hayes Xavier." They talked long into the night, planning and dreaming. Hayes spoke of building a home of their own, perhaps on a small parcel of land the Thorntons might be willing to sell. Zara shared her hope that Henry would grow up knowing stability and safety, with a father who chose him even if not by blood. "I want to marry you," Hayes said simply as the night grew late. "Not right away, I know it's too soon and there are practical matters to consider, but someday soon if you'll have me." Zara's answer was in her kiss, in the tears that spilled onto her cheeks, in the way she held tight to his hands as if afraid he might disappear. When Hayes finally left, promising to return in the morning, Zara stood in her doorway watching him walk toward the bunkhouse, his stride steady and sure in the moonlight. She felt as though her life, which had seemed so desperate just months ago, had been transformed completely. Where there had been only fear and uncertainty, now there was hope and possibility. The following weeks brought gradual changes to Crosswind. The rustlers were eventually captured by Sheriff Hollister, bringing a sense of security back to the ranch. Miguel's arm healed cleanly, and he resumed his duties with the same quiet competence as before. And Hayes and Zara's relationship, now acknowledged openly, became a source of gentle teasing among the ranch hands. "About time," Miguel told Hayes one evening, grinning. "We were taking bets on how long it would take you to speak up." In October, Hayes approached the Thorntons with his plan to build a small house on a corner of their property. To his surprise, they not only agreed but offered a generous parcel near the creek with good soil for a garden. "We've seen how you look at her," Mrs. Thornton told him privately. "And how she looks at you. That kind of love deserves a proper home." Construction began immediately, with the ranch hands pitching in during their free time. Zara continued her duties as cook, but spent every available moment planning for their future home, selecting furnishings from the Sears catalog and planting the beginnings of an herb garden that could be transplanted when the house was complete. By Christmas, the small house was finished 2 bedrooms, a cozy parlor, and a kitchen that made Zara's eyes shine with pleasure when she saw it. Hayes had insisted on large windows to let in the winter sunshine and had built a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch Henry play. They were married on Christmas Eve in the Thorntons' parlor, with the ranch hands as witnesses and the local preacher officiating. Henry, now 9 months old and crawling everywhere, sat contentedly on Miguel's lap during the ceremony, chewing on the wooden rattle Hayes had made him so many months before. Zara wore a dress of deep blue, sewn from fabric Hayes had purchased in San Elizario, and carried a small bouquet of winter greenery. Hayes, in his best shirt and a new vest, watched her approach with such naked adoration that even the most hardened of the cowboys cleared their throats and looked away, embarrassed by the raw emotion. The vows were simple, the promises heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Hayes kissed Zara with reverent tenderness, and the ranch hands erupted in cheers and whistles that made Henry clap his hands in delight. Later, after a celebratory supper and many toasts to their happiness, Hayes carried Henry to their new home while Zara walked beside him, her hand tucked in the crook of his arm. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the Texas sky. "Are you happy?" Hayes asked as they approached their house. Lamplight glowing warmly in the windows, Mrs. Thornton had insisted on going ahead to light the fires and prepare for their arrival. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Zara replied, looking up at him with shining eyes. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now it feels like it's just beginning." Hayes shifted Henry to one arm and drew Zara close with the other. "This is just the start," he promised. "The best is yet to come." And as they crossed the threshold of their new home, a family bound not by blood but by choice and love, both believed in that promise with all their hearts. Spring came to Texas in a riot of wildflowers, painting the pastures in blues and yellows and reds. The Crosswind Ranch thrived under the Thorntons' management, with Hayes continuing as foreman and Zara still providing meals for the ranch hands, now cooked in her own kitchen and carried to the bunkhouse by whatever hand was available to help. Henry, now a toddler of 14 months, had taken his first steps in February and now staggered purposefully around the yard, pursuing chickens and being gently redirected from the vegetable gardens Zara had planted. He called Hayes Pa and brightened visibly whenever his adoptive father returned from the range. In April, Zara confirmed what she had suspected for weeks: she was expecting a child, their first together. Hayes's response was to lift her off her feet and spin her around the kitchen, his face alight with joy. A brother or sister for Henry, he said, setting her down gently and placing a hand on her still flat stomach. Our family is growing. Zara covered his hand with hers. I never imagined having this again, a family, a future. You gave me that, Hayes. That night behind the store, you gave me more than just food for my baby. You gave me hope. Hayes shook his head. You always had hope, Zara. It's what kept you going, what made you strong enough to do whatever it took to keep Henry alive. He kissed her softly. I just gave you a chance to use that strength for more than just survival. In November 1877, as the first frost silvered the grass around their small house, Zara gave birth to a son they named James Thomas Xavier. Henry, now almost 2, regarded his new brother with solemn curiosity, patting the baby's head with cautious gentleness under Hayes's watchful eye. He's so small, Henry observed, his vocabulary expanding daily. You were that small once too, Hayes told him, ruffling the boy's dark hair. But you grew strong, just like James will. Zara, watching her family from her bed, felt her heart swell with gratitude. The journey from that desperate night behind the store to this moment of complete happiness seemed almost unbelievable. Yet here they were safe together and with a future stretching ahead filled with promise. 3 years later, their daughter Sarah Elizabeth joined the family, completing their household. The small house Hayes had built expanded to accommodate their growing family, with additional rooms added as needed. Their garden flourished, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for Zara's windowsills. Hayes eventually purchased a small herd of his own, running them on land leased from the Thorntons, building toward independence while maintaining the close relationship with Crosswind that had been the foundation of their lives together. Henry grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who remembered nothing of the hardships of his infancy. To him, Hayes was simply Pa, the man who taught him to ride, to rope, to respect the land and the animals that sustained them. James followed his older brother adoringly, mimicking his every move, while Sarah, independent from her first breath, charted her own course, equally comfortable in the kitchen with Zara or on horseback with Hayes. On a warm evening in the summer of 1884, as they sat on their porch watching the children play in the yard, Hayes took Zara's hand in his touch as familiar and necessary to her now as breathing. Do you ever think about it? He asked softly. That night. What might have happened if I hadn't caught you? Zara leaned against his shoulder, watching Henry, now nearly 8, teaching 4-year-old Sarah how to throw a lasso while 6-year-old James offered enthusiastic but not particularly helpful advice. Sometimes, she admitted. But not with fear anymore, just gratitude. She turned to look at him, at the face she had loved now for 8 years, lined with sun and weather but still as dear to her as ever. You saved us, Hayes, but more than that, you loved us. That was the real miracle. Hayes's arm tightened around her shoulders. Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done, he said simply. Everything good in my life came from that night. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the Xavier family gathered on their porch, Hayes and Zara watching their children's play with contented smiles, secure in the knowledge that their love, born in a moment of desperation and kindness, had built something lasting and true. From the darkest moment of Zara's life had come its greatest blessing, not just survival, but joy, family, and a love that had transformed them both. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, a cowboy catching a desperate woman stealing food for her baby, and offering her a job instead, had become the foundation of a life richer than either could have imagined. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Hayes leaned down to kiss his wife, a gesture of love as fresh and meaningful as it had been on that first night beneath the oak tree, when they had discovered that even in the harsh landscape of the Texas frontier, second chances and true love were possible for those brave enough to reach for them.